So welcome to the panel discussion. So this is going to be a fairly informal discussion. So we'll just have a brief comment from the panel guests, and then I guess we can open it up to the public. So I'll start here with Stephanie O'Flynn, who's a PhD student in animal law, going into her final year. And I think you were originally here in 2011.
I was, when I was first kind of new to.
Exactly. So we see. So it's interesting how you've come along. Since then, in terms of your own research, but how animal law has changed as well.
Yeah, definitely.
Mm-hmm. And we've John Gibbons, who's an environmental journalist. He's written many articles for the Irish Times, the Guardian, Village, Phoenix Magazine. And we have Roger Yates here, who's a kind of gatecrasher, I guess, lifelong kind of vegan activist and sociologist. So here are our three guests. One question I usually ask, before we get into the other stuff, one question I usually ask is when you become aware of the kind of importance or moral importance of animals and how they should be considered in terms of concern, moral concern. So I guess I'll start with you, Stephanie. When was the first time you came to realise this? Was it a sudden thing or was it kind of more gradual?
Well, I suppose my interest, in animal welfare and rights is really from a legal perspective. And it was when I was doing my master's in UCC a few years ago. I was trying to decide the topic for my thesis. And I've always had a love for animals, so I thought, what's the law in this area? Maybe that's something I could draw on. And I was really horrified when I realised it was a 1911 Act was the statute for protecting animals in this country. And obviously there was so many issues with this act. It was completely not fit for purpose. So that was the start, and I wrote my thesis on Irish animal protection laws, and at that time there was talk of reforming those laws and the bill that's now our 2013 Act. But really I wasn't able to investigate as much as I wanted to. So I said I would go on and do a PhD, and my ideas with my PhD over the years have obviously changed. And I suppose I moved away from this idea of welfare into the idea of rights, and that the welfare system doesn't work. It doesn't protect animals the way they need to be protected, and it's not evidence-based, and there's so many flaws with it, and that a rights approach would be the more adequate way to go. So that's where I am now.
So that's from a more philosophical position?
Yeah, I suppose I'm interested in obviously the law, but I'm also interested in philosophy and the different theories, and I'm also very interested in animal welfare science. So different data, empirical data that we'd have about animal cognition, their sentience. I would feel that that's very important, and that the law needs to be evidence-based, and it needs to take this evidence, look at the different abilities of animals and use that to design what's appropriate and how we protect them.
So on to you, John.
Yeah, I think, well, first of all, as a journalist, I have no background in environmental journalism, which meant I came to it probably about 15 years ago, really as with a blank slate. And the channel through which I came to it was figuring out when the penny dropped about climate change. And that sort of sparked, an interest in what I would call the biggest story in the world, bar none. And initially, I'll be absolutely honest, my concern was very much for us, humans. Absolutely, 100%. And thinking about the future, worrying about your kids, all the normal stuff. And I suppose these are all valid things to worry about, by the way, still are. But that journey, that 15 years, has kind of, it's been like a voyage into the heart of darkness. And at the centre of that darkness is human nature. And I realised that rather than saving us from climate change, the question is, can the world be saved from humans? And that realisation that we're the problem means that any solution has to be framed in the context of all life on Earth, not just human life. And I've increasingly come to see that our role is, we're an important species, but we're one among many. And I think our obsession with ourselves has got us into this mess. And I think it's only by broadening our empathy with the living world that we're going to, if we're going to get out of this mess, we're only going to do it by stopping our predatory approach on the rest of life. And so I think that slow awakening for me has really drained my anthropocentrism dry. That's how I put it.
All right. So Roger?
Yeah, if is a good thing, isn't it? I've been asked that question a lot, and I always think back to when I was a kid. I think I had some kind of perspective about fairness across the board, about, is that fair? And I remember two things. I was at school on the Isle of Wight, a place called Ryde, and I remember jumping from desk to desk, letting the wasps out that everyone else was trying to kill. And then my first job was a junior projectionist, and I was in the staff room one time, and an usher, female usher, was there, and a crane fly, flying down long legs, was going up and down the wall, as they do, and she took a shoe off and went, bam! And I said, well, what do you do that for? And she said, well, I think they're really ugly. I said, well, I think you're pretty ugly, but I wouldn't have done that to you. And I just thought that wasn't fair, And then when we got to the 1970s, I started to read some philosophy, and obviously Peter Singer was out at the time. And then a guy called Tom Reagan started to write. And that gave me a kind of rights-based grounding philosophically for my ideas about fairness, and it all kind of just gelled together. I kind of started sabbing hunts, disrupting hunts, and then I went vegan very quickly in 1979. Didn't go through a vegetarian phase, which I've always been quite grateful for, actually. So everything kind of came together. So activism, the idea of fairness, and then the philosophical grounding, which was always for me rights-based. That always appealed to me. I was interested in what you were saying there about, because like animal rights is about moral rights. It's not really about legal rights, but moral rights with support become codified into law. So that's really kind of interesting, in the sense that it all comes together. It did for me anyway.
Yeah. So I guess one thing that was a bit alarmed by was your talk, John. Earlier, I think a lot of people. Yeah, I thought a lot of people had. So, a lot of that seemed like that's the reality of the situation, or at least close to it anyway. And even if it's not, you'd say, well, there is probably a high probability that is possible. So it's probably not good to take.
Which is possible?
What you outlined earlier. So even if you said, well, I don't think it'll be that bad. There's still a chance that it could be that bad, and
a high chance.
There's a high chance, okay, and you wouldn't want to take your chances on it.
No. If it was a plane, you wouldn't buy a ticket for it.
I'm just wondering, what is there a different way of actually, explaining the reality and how you say you're trying to persuade people to change their attitude? Do you think they're exactly the same? Or do you think you could communicate it in a more indirect way to get people to change?
Well, I did touch on that a bit earlier, and I did make the point that my approach is a little more direct. And, I'm quite happy to leave it to other branches of environmental activism to try the softly approach. And unfortunately, nothing has changed. We've had 30, even 40 years since really the environmental movement pulled its socks on in the early 1970s. And during all that time, every environmental measure, every ecological measure has gotten exponentially worse, which suggests to me that incremental environmentalism has been a complete failure. In fact, I'd even argue that the green movement unintentionally has helped to lubricate industrial capitalism by making it feel less objectionable, as if it was a little bit green and not that bad. But in terms of altering the trajectory, not one iota.
Mm-hmm. So would you see any technological interventions as being effective?
In terms of, say, changing the dial on climate and stuff?
Well, I guess climate in particular, and say in vitro meat, or what's now known as clean meat in particular.
Yeah, I mean, any technologies, for example, that could replace, say, animal products with products that come out of the lab, or products that can be developed from vegetable base. They should be. That's where our research should be, of course.
Yeah.
And there's a company called Beyond Meat, and they've produced something called the Impossible Burger. Well, I was talking to a guy from the BBC recently, and he told me he'd had an Impossible Burger recently, and he said it was incredible. It actually drips sort of impossible fake blood as you bite it. He said it gives the mouth taste, everything. And he said he loves burgers, but he said he'd never see a reason why he would choose again to eat a killed animal, having had this delicious burger. Now, I'd love to see him talk about that on the BBC.
Yeah.
And for farmers who I do deal with quite a bit, they kind of react with hostility when I say this. You're trying to destroy our business. And I'm saying, no, I'm trying to protect the future. And if your business is conspiring unintentionally with destroying the future, well then, that's I'm not sure that's a business model any of us want to stick with. And I think there's a big communications thing that needs to happen to explain to farmers that the main function of farming is to produce sustainable food that feeds the largest number of people with the least impact. That's the purpose of farming, as I would understand it. And I think that purpose has been swept away and forgotten about and lost. And it's a pity, because if you could produce a vegetable-based Impossible Burger, why on earth would anybody choose to farm animals? It's a ghastly process. I mean, think of all the pain, all the misery. The manual castration of pigs, for example. Just pick them up and slice off their balls. I mean, seriously, who on earth would then say, that's okay? If there was an alternative to a system of absolute misery, of highly intelligent animals, and if there's a good alternative, if your bacon can be produced using methods other than animal farming, and by the way, even non-intensive animal farming can be pretty ghastly. There's so much cruelty involved in it, separating parents from babies, isolation, all that kind of psychological cruelty on sentient creatures. So from my point of view, if there's other ways of doing it, great, but technological fixes on the larger scale, like things like geoengineering and stuff, forget about it.
Right.
No.
I guess we're talking about animal production in general.
Yeah.
And one thing, you're highly critical in your talk of agriculture in Ireland and how politicians are lobbied by the animal industry. So I'm just curious, do you think in the next 10, 15 years that technology will put them out of business? So say, for example, clean meat does become commercially viable. Will that put a lot of conventional agriculture?
Well, it's a funny thing. As the fellow says, not a lot of people know this, but between 60 and 70% of the beef farmers in Ireland today are insolvent. They lose money. For every hectare they have under beef production, they lose money. It's reckoned they lose about 230 euros a hectare. And you probably say, well, if you lose 230 euros a hectare, how do you stay in business? You get 400 euros a hectare from the EU to be in this business. So you live on the difference. Yeah. So beef farming for farmers is a lousy business. It doesn't offer them security. It creates huge issues with emissions, with the use of nitrates for fertilizer, the runoffs into our waterways and so on, and the output for the farmer is lousy. I mean, one of the talks that I found most interesting at the Citizens' Assembly last November was a guy came in to talk about an organic farm down in Cork. And what was extraordinary about it is he said, right, there's 4 of us involved in this farm. We farm about 7 acres of land. 4 of us are involved in the farming, and we have 3 more people involved in the marketing and distribution of our produce. So we've basically got about, it might have been slightly more than 7 acres, it might have been 9 or 10 acres. 7 people fully employed on 9 or 10 acres, okay? Earning a decent living, producing organic food and selling it to the markets. Now, I don't know if anyone here knows the ratio of the number of acres that a farmer would need, a beef farmer would need, in order to lose money, right? One beef farmer with any number of beef cattle, if he had less than 100 acres, one beef farmer couldn't support himself on less than 100 acres. So like people say, oh, you have to protect jobs in agriculture. Absolutely. But beef farming is, again, the most inefficient way to not create jobs. And I think, as well, probably beef farming in Ireland is partly it's a semi-retirement job because it's quite low. There's very little to do. So a lot of farmers who are involved in it, they kind of have part-time jobs and stuff, and they've got a few cattle on a bit of land, and that system has sort of rocked along. But you still, as I said, nearly 7 million head of cattle on this system. And if we were accounting for the external costs of beef farming, like in any activity, you have the costs, the direct costs, and you have the externalities. This is basic economics. The externalities of, say, producing a pound of beef are probably, depending on how you calculate it, could be an extra euro, could be an extra €2 in externalities. But at the moment, those externalities are not borne because there is no carbon tax, for example. There is no environmental taxes, effectively no environmental taxes on it, with the result that a losing business, farmers are still engaged with because the market signals are all wrong. We're actually subsidising a form of agriculture that is environmentally damaging, and we're not supporting horticulturalists, we're not supporting organic farmers at all, which is crazy.
I'll come to you in a second, Roger, about clean meat. But Stephanie, I'm just wondering from a legal perspective, I've read a number of cases in the US and I think Europe now where you get kind of plant-based milk or milk alternatives as it's known, or meat alternatives, and a lot of the animal business are protesting against this. They're saying, well, it can't really be, they're saying that soy milk and almond milk, it shouldn't be defined as milk because it doesn't come from a cow. And I think something similar is happening with fake meat or clean meat in the future. I'm just wondering, are you familiar with any of that in terms of...
that wouldn't be completely my area, so I wouldn't know a huge amount about it. I suppose what I would be familiar with was some of the campaigns that they had where they were advertising about, dairy milk being inhumane, and there was a lot of uproar about that they shouldn't be allowed to put out those types of campaigns, and the ruling on that was that they were allowed. So I mean, you can definitely see a bit of a shift there when they're actually advertising that, and they can do that. With regards meat being labelled as meat, I'm not quite sure. Right.
Okay. So Roger, to what extent, if any, should do you think animal activists should emphasise clean meat or kind of fake meat? So what role do you think activists should play in that?
Well, it's interesting because I think it's going to be a kind of generational thing in the sense that it's all developing really quickly, the technology and everything, and so that means the processes are changing as well. And I think one of the best things about the clean meat issue is when they said this is not a vegan issue, we don't actually care what vegans think about it, which I kind of welcomed that in a way. What we tend to do in terms of vegan outreach is just inform people about that. And it's very much in the lines of what John was saying here about the fact that there's a kind of stealth thing about it. They reckon, Richard Branson reckons within 30 years all meat will be plant-based. And I don't call it fake meat, I call it vegan meat. Or plant-based meat, that kind of stuff. And so they reckon that, some people reckon within 5 to 10 years, if you go and get something processed like your meat and potato pie, then that's going to be your clean meat in there without people knowing it. The idea of capitalism was just mentioned. And so, in theory, not only morally would you say, why would you choose one from the other? The new stuff should be a lot cheaper. Whether that's ever going to come down to the retail side of it, I don't know. But when you think about what you're eliminating the breeding, the artificial insemination, the growing, the transportation, the slaughterhouses, a vast infrastructure, and you're just replacing that with, a laboratory and then a distribution network. It should be massively cheaper.
Yeah,
not only for the Earth, but just economically, it should be cheaper.
And if I could just add a rider to that, there's a perfect analogue for what you've just described, and that is the transition at the moment from fossil fuel to electric vehicles. It's happening way faster than we think. We've reached an inflection point with that. 5 years' time, there are going to probably be more electric vehicles certainly being sold than fossil fuel. And exactly as you said, the embedded processes connected with extracting, transporting, having wars over fossil energy has been an absolute disaster for humanity over the last 100 years. It has destroyed the Middle East and other areas, environmental disasters, petrostates, the whole shooting match. And yet you can actually have a technological quantum shift, which basically says actually all that technology, all those internal combustion engines are old news. You can jump over them and you can have a car or a bus or a lorry or a scooter that is electrically powered, which means clean for cities, clean at source, or sorry, at the point of access. And then that gives you the scope to completely change your energy system. So you can have a wind-powered or a nuclear-powered or whatever your favourite form of low carbon energy to power that system. And the other interesting thing, exactly as you said, is that the conversion of primary energy to spinning wheels with electric versus fossil fuel is a quantum shift. I think it's somewhere 5 to 7 times more efficient at converting electricity into forward motion. So you take a century of technology and you say, actually, this is old. I mean, think about it. The internal combustion engine is 19th century technology. That was the late 1880s, 1890s they developed it. And we're still using it. Imagine setting fire to petrol and diesel, to fire pistons, to spin wheels.
All these small explosions.
All these billions of tiny explosions, and then spewing filth out the back of it. I mean, one of these days we're going to look around and say, what were we thinking?
I think that's where the technological thing, be it vegan or not, and of course there's the issue about the fact that some of it has been through the vivisection labs, so that's obviously created a moral issue for vegans. Then you've got the sampling problem. So then you've got the thing about taking cells, but then they're now saying that the technology has developed so they can actually take cells from, say, a chicken's feather who was living on a sanctuary. So, we've got Declan Bowens down the road there doing his vegan outreach with 400 animals on the sanctuary, and there's where you could get your, thing. I've always thought, well, why couldn't you take, a biopsy or, a sample from humans? That'd be fine by me.
Yeah, I wouldn't have any in principle objection. I'm not sure if I would find it the most appetizing, but I guess if somebody...
Well, it's weird. We were talking about that earlier because we were talking about the fact, from a vegan point of view, all the people walking past us in Westmoreland Street, these are kind of adults. It was still on baby food.
Yeah.
It's really kind of weird. And then we were talking about the fact that at one point they produced some ice cream made from human breast milk, and everybody was going, yeah, like this and everything. And we were going, hang on a second, you're quite happy to drink the best breast milk of another species for your never weaned society.
Yeah.
So it's just a question of perspective, I think.
Yeah. And as a sociologist, I'm just curious what you think, because we're quite selective on what type of species it is as well. If you say it's cow's milk, it's okay. Maybe goats is okay, but say for example you say it's horse milk or from some other mammal, you get the same kind of visceral disgust.
You want some rat milk,
rat milk as well, I'm sure.
Billy Connolly had a joke about this. He asked the question. He said, at some point, somebody, some human, first figured out that cow's milk was drinkable, and he said, "What's he doing?" It is, when you think about it for a moment, and I saw a similar exercise to that where somebody did this on the street thing, and they introduced a brand new brand of milk called Barker's. And it had a nice label and logo. And all these people come along and test it, and then they explain, this is dog breast milk. Barker's, get it? Anyway, so, and people next thing are spitting out the milk.
That's right.
Yeah, so it is interesting from a psychological and I guess sociological point of view.
Yeah, I mean, social change tends to meet with resistance across the board.
Yeah.
And that really is because sociologically most people are conformist. And, you know, we conform to the norms and values of the society we're born in, generally speaking. And the interesting thing about that is that even radicals within the society tend to be rather conventional when you scratch under the skin and get beyond what they're radical about. You know, there's a kind of conventional core to a lot of people. You know, we in kind of critical sociology or radical sociology always tend to think that, you know, if we could educate people to think critically and radically about one issue, that they would then kind of transfer it. You know, it'd be a transferable kind of moral, if you like. So, you know, you're in a kind of patriarchal, you know, capitalist society, and so you would then see the interconnections. Doesn't always happen, unfortunately.
Yeah, there was actually, I was reading a piece during the week about some philosopher, and he was on about, about moral blind spots, how we can be completely blind to kind of terrible things that are happening. We may think about them superficially or not think about them that much or just bury our head in the sand. And he was speculating, I wonder is there anything now that most people see as okay or don't really think about it at all, but future generations will see it as appalling. I mean, I guess the way we treat animals is a perfect example now, but I guess is there any other ones that we are just genuinely oblivious to?
I think that, I'll come back to it again, setting fire to stuff for energy.
That could be the rush hour.
Yeah.
Somebody once said, I think a philosopher was talking about how rational it is to want to get out of work as soon as your work is finished.
Yeah.
And yet, that rational decision made by everybody at the same time leads to irrationality of you being stuck in traffic.
Just tragedy of the commons.
Twice a day, kind of,
Yeah.
Yeah.
I guess that's the environmental problem as well. Like everybody wants clean air, but you know they want to use their own kind of motor vehicle and pollute. But you know it'd be great if everybody else didn't. So I don't know. Have you two had soon?
I'm okay for
You're
now.
okay,
What I was
Tom?
going to actually mention was just that we were talking about our different views of different animals. I think that's really interesting. You know, back when we had the really warm spell, the way people were so enraged when they seen dogs in cars and windows down, and I think it's really interesting then when you say it to them, when you think about it, cattle, sheep, all of those animals are being transported in those conditions all the time, and the minute you say that, they don't want to know. So this kind of moral schizophrenia when it comes to the way we want to treat certain animals depending on our feelings or empathy towards them, I think is very, very interesting.
Yeah, I'm wondering, is that something that people genuinely believe, or they don't see it themselves? They think, it's appalling the way somebody treats their dog, or companion animal at home, or say a stray dog, for example, and then they're okay, consuming chicken.
I think it's a mental block. I think for a lot of people, like humans, we don't like change, and I think for a lot of people, they don't want to challenge themselves when it comes to thinking about treatment of animals that will change their daily lives.
There's a lot of trust involved. I mean, Peter Singer made this point, is that when people go to the supermarket, they know that if they take a styrofoam thing down with flesh in there, that they know there was no cruelty involved in what they're just buying. And the reason they know that is because there exists something like the ISPCA, whose job is to stop cruelty. So there's a lot of kind of trust involved, and also ignorance, of course, and often willful ignorance. So, we kind of like trust the farmers who all say we love our animals and all that kind of stuff, and we've all been socialised to think that it's all grand. And also, I think we do have some kind of adherence to the idea that the system must be the most rationally organised that there is.
Or many people aren't complaining. There's very few people complaining, so it must be okay. I guess there's confirmation bias as well, because there could be a lot of loud people protesting against it, but if it got that stamp on it, they'd say, well, here's one example, and that confirms my bias, so you'll go along with that, but you ignore what everyone else is saying.
This is a big psychological thing for humans.
Yeah. So I'm just going to open it up, I guess, to the audience here, if anybody would like to ask any questions or make any comments. Yeah, you're at the back.
My question is for, I think, John. Yeah, so you're saying that your primary like opposition to animal farming is that it's bad for environment.
That
Primary,
was,
like from what we were
that
talking-
was my gateway to it. Right?
Yeah.
That's
But-
probably how I came to it. But yeah.
But normal farming, plant-based farming, is not good for environment. Not that good for environment in the current form, because there's thing called arsenic toxicity, soil acidity, and like all like a lot of these plants like they deplete the soil of their nutrition. Like the topsoil is depleting. Like in India, it's a big problem. So in India, like 40% of the population, which is huge, 40% in India is like 540 million people. It's strict vegetarian. So like to produce that much food, a lot of farming is done,
Yeah.
and that is like over the years, like it's depleting topsoil.
Yeah.
So just taking to like my point is like organic farming can't produce that much food, especially when you're saying that like in the next 13 years the population will be by 1 billion more people. So people are growing, they need more housing and everything, and so like the land used for agriculture and like farming will be reduced, and we need more food. Like it's counterproductive to each other. So how do you think like we can manage that? We can sustain that?
Well, I think you're right. Every form of intensive industrial production, whether it's agricultural, industrial, or otherwise, has impacts. So you can run down the soil through for example, wheat cropping or other plant-based foods. So, you know, plant-based is not a nirvana. It doesn't just cure everything. And the problem here, I guess, is lots of demand, lots of people, ever-growing demand, and the ability, for example, of soils to withstand, you know, the pressures that we're putting on soils, the decline of microbial activity all around the world that's been monitored in soils, because they're basically been hammered with insecticides, herbicides, fungicides, pesticides, phosphates, nitrates, you name it. And we're taking this, you know, somebody described, I think, civilization as being 4 inches deep. That's the topsoil. That's basically, human civilization exists on 4 inches of topsoil. Now, you kill that topsoil, and you see, dang it, you keep coming back to this. We've corralled ourselves into a Malthusian trap. We've tricked the system, and we've broken through. I mean, even you go back to things like the Bosch-Haber method of nitrogen production back in at the end of the First World War. Yeah, that alone allowed agricultural production to, I think, quadruple. There would never have been more than 2 billion people on Earth without that, the ability to make nitrogen from nitrogen in the air. That Bosch-Haber process. Completely, there's probably 5 billion people alive today who would never have been alive without that. It was a trick. It was a brilliant trick. And we've ended up in an impossible situation where there are far too many of us with far too many demands. And the world, not only is it not getting bigger, it's getting smaller. Desertification, we're losing about 10 million acres a year in desertification. That's going to increase. So what are we doing? We're pushing into marginal land, pushing nature further and further out of marginal land, but we're losing land faster than we're acquiring new land. So, you know, what's the outcome for this? Well, and also, of course, we're doing all this against a backdrop of a quickly changing climate system, where, for example, if you believe those pesky scientists, large swathes of the Middle East will be uninhabitable by 2040 to 2050. Just uninhabitable. Everybody will have left. Daytime temperatures 50 to 55 degrees centigrade throughout the summer. Nobody can live there. You can just cower in air conditioning, but basically that's that. So you're talking about whole sections of what is currently habitable becoming uninhabitable, and all that flows from that. And of course that's going to devastate. It's already beginning, but it's going to increasingly devastate agricultural production. This is the other side of climate change, is that, you know, it's already, we're getting reduction, for example, in wheat. Global wheat crop hasn't grown in years, and it's probably going down slightly. That's going to go down more and more. There's direct correlation. For every 1 degree centigrade you go up, you lose X percentage of agricultural output. And so we're We're in a tricky spot, but I'm sure it'll be fine. We'll invent something.
Yeah, they'll invent something.
Yeah.
Can I just add briefly to that?
Yep.
The soil was an early vegan issue. There is one of the vegan pioneers of the vegan social movement called Eva Batt. She wrote in 1964 that veganism was one thing and one thing only, which was to stop the exploitation of what she called in those days fellow man, the animals, and the soil on which we rely on to exist. So they actually talked about exploiting the soil. And then that issue returned through a book called Diet for a New America by John Robbins in the 1980s. And again, the issue of soil erosion and what we're doing with it. Now, I think the answer to it is that we're going to get a lot more land back when people go vegan. That's one issue. But also, the issues about the problems that might be caused by making and then harvesting crops, I think, are resolved by having more vegans. Because that means that once we get socio-political power, we can then say to the farming community, we want you to start farming this way, not that way. And so that would then we would move towards technology this way, you would move towards issues about veganic agriculture, this kind of thing. So, wherever there's injustice is a vegan issue, but also whenever there's kind of shortages and stuff, that's also one. And the early vegans kind of recognised that, and they kind of factored it in. There was a movement called Movement for Compassionate Living, and they are like an offshoot of the Vegan Society. They've got like a wood-based idea of society. It's not a primitive thing. But it's kind of taking, if you like, the carrying capacity of the earth into account. And I do think that the size of the human population is a vegan issue.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah,
I think it's level. I think it's forecast to level off in the next. I don't know.
Well, plateau. It'll plateau probably by mid-century at somewhere between, it depends on how you calculate it, but somewhere between 9 and 11 billion probably.
Yeah.
The problem with that, of course, is that assumes, you see, while the fertility rate is declining, the number of people, the gross number of people in the world who are at their peak reproductive age is increased. So even with a lower fertility rate, you're still getting that. It's just the size thing. It's a bit like the carbon dioxide stock in the atmosphere.
Yeah.
You're stuck with the stock, and probably there've been all kinds of estimates on this as to what's a sustainable level. My favourite one is a biologist who specialises he's a primatologist, I guess, and he reckoned that if you simply apply the same rules to humans as you apply to our other primates, he said the maximum global carrying capacity for modern humans is about 700,000.
Yeah.
Well, there you can bring in the law to make condoms free.
Yeah, that could be interesting. I guess I'll bring in Stephanie again. In terms of legislation, I've kind of two queries two things I'm kind of curious about. One is, how difficult is it to pass legislation, say, for more progressive animal law, or even environmental law? How difficult is it to pass that? And secondly, how difficult is it to fully implement?
Well, I suppose there's always the link between activism and actually getting topics out there and raising awareness, and that the law will generally follow. So I suppose an example would be fur farming at the moment. There's obviously been several attempts to try and legislate in this area, but we have seen the publication of a bill. So it's all this activism and this years are put into trying raising awareness results in bills. Sometimes they don't proceed any further, but the bill has to pass both houses of the Oireachtas. Generally it would be a process of reviewing it if there's amendments needed, and then if it's passed, once it's signed by the President, it comes into law. But I think activism is a huge link into the law. We saw this year the prohibition of the use of wild animals in circuses, and again that came from social awareness and public campaigning.
Mhm.
So it can be done, but
Yeah.
you know, there's a massive link with public awareness and activism
Sure.
there.
And was there much resistance to this, and what was the public reaction like, broadly speaking?
In relation to,
Say like the circuses or the...
I think with circuses there wasn't huge resistance at all. I mean, like Ireland, I think we're really 40th country to bring in that, so we're
Right.
kind of behind other
Right.
countries. So I suppose there was something to follow suit with.
Mhm.
I think with other areas of law, obviously economics and business is always a huge obstacle, you know, balancing people's professional freedom against animal rights and animal welfare. So some issues where there's a big economic
Yeah.
impact, you know, for zoos or for circuses, I should say, you know, they can still continue and not use animals, and it's not as impactful on
Sure.
their business. But other areas, if it means closures of businesses, it
Yeah.
can be a lot more difficult. Yeah.
Yeah, and I'm sure the circus lobby, if you want to use that term, is probably not as much weaker than, say, the meat industry.
Yeah.
Certainly.
Yeah.
Yeah.
That's for sure.
So is there any other questions?
I have a question to Roger about the activism. We have just started like a month ago with the more activists we know on the street, but I think that's really hard to get people that are close to us, like family and friends. So then how do you deal with the situation? Because I know that when I am on the streets, you know, people that stop by, they are kind of interested on that subject or not, or just they want to fight a few, but at the same time they have a small interest on that. And usually with the family and friends, colleagues, they are just like, oh my god, there comes the vegan, so we don't want to hear it. So like, how do you deal with that?
It's an interesting thing. Quite a lot of vegans have written about this. I've done a film myself, and it's a kind of sociological issue. The family thing first. This is a particular issue for new young vegans who find this problem the hardest one, and also the most kind of pertinent, if you like. And the kind of stark reality is that talking to your own family about moral issues could be the problem. And so, as you said, in terms of people's general, kind of curiosity, I call people vegan curious now. So people do come up and they ask questions and stuff. But then if a stranger says something to you, that's different from if a member of the family says something to you. And again, for the youngsters, there's a generational issue here. Normally, morality is taught by the elders to the younger members of the family. What you tend to get in veganism and other issues like this is that the younger members are trying to say moral things to the elders in the family. So that can be a problem. And then the other sociological issue is that, just as a general matter, when you're dealing with your family, you're dealing with the family baggage. It's not just an exchange of information. It's kind of, I'm not going to be told this by my elder, younger sister, my brother. There's lots of things going on in the family. And so that's basically the thing. They might be quite open to the information. It's just that the person delivering it is the wrong person. It's just a fact of life, unfortunately. You might be the worst person to talk to your family about it, and because they're your family, you desperately want them to be open to your ideas and everything. Right.
Just to add to your point, in my experience, I've had the most success not convincing necessarily, but showing my family about veganism just through cooking for them. And I think for my friends as well, you can sneak in some stuff about veganism just through food, because I think food is a really good way to connect people, and you don't do it with you're not arguing, or you're not discussing. You're just going look, this is really good, and it happens to be vegan, and then people start thinking, and then they're a bit more open to conversation. At least that's what's happened in my experience.
Stealth veganism.
Yeah.
Yes, is there any other question? Yeah.
Okay, so I don't want to hurt anyone. So I'm originally from India, and I've been here for a year now. And I've been a vegetarian my whole life. I've never had meat or anything in my life. So when I came here, so I attended the Christian Union event in our college. I'm from Trinity. I studied in Trinity. So like 2 months, like as an Indian, like the way I grew up, I believe in like sanctity of life. Like all living forms have some rights to them, and like so like in Hindu mythology, like our soul are recycled. So like I can be an elephant in the next life and something like that. So we believe that they are all equal. Like they have the rights. But like, when I came here, like I attended the event. So like to my surprise, I found out that people are made in the God's image, and everything else is for us to use. So that's why I believe that in India, like 40% of the population is vegetarian after all the things. The popularization through like KFC and everything, they still have to serve some vegetarian options. McDonald's, KFC, even though like. So my point is, when you are in a Western society, which is like which was a shock to me, but like it is written like to religious people at least, who like borrow their morality from the religion. Like how do you explain to them that like they believe that like God has sent all of this for our consumption? Like how do you like challenge that? Because it's like deep-rooted belief for like the last 800 years, so I don't know how long. So like how do you, like it's a fundamental part of your life, like it's who you are from like generation to generation. So how do you change that?
In the Christian tradition, don't we actually eat the body and blood of our Saviour?
So it's a form of cannibalism.
Some would say.
Metaphorically, anyway.
It's a bit weird too.
I think the first speaker touched on this slightly because she was saying that one of the 10 commandments is thou shalt not kill. And that can extend to animals. It doesn't say what not to kill.
No, it says that like we are created in the God's image, and everything else in this world is for our upliftment. Like, I don't know how like language.
Yeah, and even ideas like stewardship and dominion. I mean, there's animal welfare elements to that. But there's also the thing about we're in charge type of thing. So it is a kind of human supremacist kind of position. Yeah, I understand that. And, you know, the US vegan society, they kind of embraced the idea of reverence for life. But that got them into problems, I think, about plants then. You know, you got the issue of, well, plants are living as well, you know, that kind of issue. And I suppose, is underlying your question a kind of like you know, sort of kind of Jain kind of position? Is that where you're coming from, do you think?
I don't understand the word.
You know, the kind of Jain religion or philosophy, you know, the kind of, you know...
Yeah, Hindu, Jain...
Yeah, kind of harmlessness and, you know, ahimsa, you know...
Because, like, when you talk about plant-based diets, so, like, if you're eating flour, like wheat flour, so you... Like, I'm from a farming family, so you only cultivate it after it's dead, after it's turned brown, after it's dried. You pick the fruit. You don't cut down the tree. You pick the fruit.
Right.
It's meant for that. It's meant to spread the seed. So, like, you are not actually killing the... Yeah.
This is like a fruitarian philosophy.
Yeah, like, you are just, like, if it's already dead, or you are just picking it off, like, you are not harming the actual plant or anything.
Understood, yeah.
Yeah, so it can't, like, you can, like, justify it that way. That it's, although it's alive, but had we already dead, or we didn't kill anything. Yeah.
I think it's no coincidence that Christianity has been the religion of choice of colonial powers for the last 500-600 years. And I think the philosophical underpinning is one of conquest and dominion over lesser, whether we define it as other creatures or our fellow human beings who aren't equipped with muskets, right? So that has been, you know, I'm not blaming Christianity for it, but it's certainly been the underpinning of what we would euphemistically call Western civilization as it spread its orbit of kindness right around the world.
I guess you could extend that then to kind of Western secularism, that extended that idea and implicitly still holds it, even though it may want to deny that there's any kind of association or is tainted anyway by Christianity in many ways. I talk to people as well, I'm not Christian anyway, but the way they see animals, morally speaking, suggests that they still do.
Yeah, I think you're right. I don't think the philosophical basis has changed profoundly. We may have de-Christianized Western society to some extent, but I think the philosophical framework probably hasn't changed very much.
Yeah. I guess one thing I'm interested in then, because I think it's very difficult, if not impossible, to change people's kind of moral, political beliefs. They may actually, change what they see as important. But in terms of, say, people's political beliefs or religious beliefs, is it possible to make a case for, to extend their concern, say, for the environment? You could say, well, whatever political belief you hold, you could say, well, there's good environmental or vegan justifications that are compatible with that belief. So if you're a socialist, you could say, well, there's vegan, that's compatible with veganism, or even if you're a libertarian, you could say, well, in a strict sense, that is not necessarily incompatible with veganism. Because so I'm just wondering what you think about those ideas.
Yeah, I think, and I don't want to oversimplify, but I think we're at heart, whatever philosophical badge you want to stick on us, we as a species, we're profoundly irrational or non-rational. We've kind of coated ourselves with a patina of rationalism, but scrape that away, especially introduce a little fear, a little greed, a little whatever, and suddenly we're back to our, shall we say, more primordial thing, which is, and you see this very quickly in any society, as soon, for example, as social strife or war breaks out. Like humans are at each other like that. So I think I'm just suggesting that we've a light papering of what we would call civilization that prevents us from doing atrocities to one another. That prevents us in the normal course of events. We're civil to each other. There's reasons for that. If I lunge out and attack you, I go to jail, right? Yeah. So there's social sanctions and criminal sanctions. But I think that desire for people to do that to one another and to take and to dominate and to, I think it's there, it hasn't gone away. And I think I would see it as our kind of almost our original sin, if you want to use that. Our original sin is that we're, I think I used the phrase earlier, we're a psychopathic species.
You think we're psychopathic?
Yes.
In the literal sense or the metaphorical?
Literal.
Right.
I think we practice psychopathy.
Yeah.
I think
selective psychopathy.
Well, sure, yeah.
Well,
But,
Freud said that human beings were ferocious animals.
The most ferocious.
Yeah, and that's probably one of the reasons why we've been successful in inverted commas.
I think it's the key reason we're ruthless to a fault. And of course we've bred ruthlessness into each other because most of us are the great-great-great-great-grandchildren of rapists. Sorry to say it. But we have violence is bred into us. Think about the people who got to breed, the dominant males.
We always
the alpha males, the guys who
these things
cut the throats of the nice guys didn't get to breed. Yeah. We have bred violence and psychopathy into our natures. Just think about it. Think about all the wars and conflicts, and think about the alpha males who actually passed on their and think of the generations of breeding towards warfare and violence, and think of the societies, look at them right now, that have benefited. You go to London, go to Paris, go to Madrid, go to New York, and look at the wealth of the world accumulated in these imperial centres, where that violence, that preparedness to obliterate the other has been a fantastically successful play. It has made countries, certain countries, the wealthiest countries on earth. And the same countries that reap the colonial benefit are now the wealthiest, most powerful countries on earth. It has worked for them. Violence works. Psychopathy is rational, if that makes sense. In the way we work, if we were to we've lots of space in the room, if we were to invite half a dozen of the world's billionaires to join us, Jeff Bezos or some of these other guys, right? These are crazy people. They'll do anything. And they're not happy this guy's worth 20 billion, but he's frustrated that he's not worth 30 billion. And he will fight and he will ruin your life if he can and flatten your country to get to 30 billion because 20 billion is not enough. He only compares himself with the other billionaire who's got 25 billion. And that's the thing. And these are the most successful people in the world, are also the craziest people in the world, which is kind of strange. I know there's some concert pianists and composers and authors. I know that. We've done some fabulous things. I'm not, completely and totally anti-human, despite what you might think. But by and large, taken together, put in a bag, we're a problem.
Yeah, well, I mean that's true, and I guess the other side is that there are people that are, appalled by some of the stuff that has happened throughout history. I mean, everybody that's here and other people are concerned about animals and other kind of minority groups. So I guess that's part of our nature too.
I'm sorry, by the way, if I've maligned anybody's great grandparents. I take it all back. I'm sure they were lovely.
Well, I think you pretty much everybody is included. You're quite inclusive.
Totally inclusive. Yeah. It's yeah.
So just to add something. I know you seem a very hopeful person. That's gonna be a better future.
You think?
No, but
Did you listen to
I'm joking. But the thing is, you said you have kids.
Yeah.
And they're like, this is something that worries me about it, having kids. What kind of award are we going to give to them? And exactly the same example you gave to that 15 years old girl in the Swedish Congress saying, like, what is the future? Is that really worth, bringing a child to this world in this way that we are going right now, like in this century? You don't know how many years it's going to take for us to destroy everything.
I think that's a profound question, and one question I'd ask John, because I think about this. Do people who are having children now, if they think about having children and their children's future, which presumably you would, do you think they've totally rejected the climate change thesis or just never thought about it?
Interesting. I know people now who are choosing not to have kids because they're looking at it and saying no thanks.
What about the ones who are?
Well, I'll take myself, if I may, briefly. I guess my eyes were opened probably to this issue when I had my first child. And simply because I was beginning to think about her 30 years, 40 years in the future. And suddenly dates like 2030 and 2040 and 2050 were actually the age that she'd be at when she was my age. So suddenly the future kind of came hurtling towards me by having a kid. Now, if I knew then what I know now, maybe that's what I'm saying here, would I have had? I mean, kids are the best, certainly, and this I'm sure is the experience for almost every parent, is, they're the best of you, the best thing you've ever done, on the one hand. On the other hand, I feel a terrible guilt for bringing children into this world. And that guilt manifests itself in a responsibility to show up in places like here on Sunday afternoons to try and, expunge my guilt by being useful in some way.
So we're therapy.
Oh yeah. Well, what else? This is therapy.
Well, I guess it's if it's only as you say, the psychopaths and the people that are thoughtlessness, that are not thoughtful about it or having kids. Well, maybe that's bad. Maybe we do need people that are concerned about these things to have kids as well to kind of counter it.
Yeah. Now, vegan parents' kids rebel as well.
Well, that's true. I mean, actually, I've heard of one story. I don't know if to laugh or cry. Two sociologists that were very active in social justice, and their teenage son rebelled against them because, well, they were kind of very radical politically. So the only way he could go is he said, "Well, I'm alt-right now."
Okay.
So I don't know if he was just doing it to piss off his parents or if he.
Well, that would work.
Yeah, that was like the only way to go is to go completely in the other direction.
Yeah, as long that seems reasonable though to not to reasonably be alt-right, but reasonable to want to reject your parents.
Sure.
And what all the stupid stuff they told you.
Yeah.
I think every generation feels that way about their parents.
Yeah.
Because I certainly know every generation of parents thinks that their children are the worst idiots ever.
Yeah. So maybe there is optimism.
That goes back to your question. Parents might think you're just being vegan just to be awkward.
Can I say something about the kid thing? So like you're saying that you are like not hopeful about the future and everything because of how the world's going, but like you could have that's not a rational fear because if you were like 1,000 years back, you might have feared that your child will be killed by a tiger. There was no environmental problem going on then. It's just like the environment was too ferocious for them. Like he could have died by a tiger or some attack or something else. If you were like 200 years ago or 100 years ago, they could have died of Spanish flu or the Black Death.
You're absolutely right on that.
So like, there is no rationality behind like don't have kids because the future is bleak. Because we have the power to change the future, and we have done that. So if I take the example of India, so like when the British, the English left the Indian coast, the life expectancy of a person was 36 years. 36 years. So if a child was born on that exact date, he would have died at the age of 36. But in seeing like after the British left and how the things developed, and in the ensuing 36 years, the life expectancy went to be 70 or something because of the radical changes in like medication and everything, and like money flowing in and everything. So life expectancy changed, and though the parent feared that his child would die at the age of 36, now he's going to live at 70 or 80 or something else. So like future is ever changing. We can't like stop having babies just because we are not sure of the future, because like our kid has the power to change it. Rather than like
I take your point, but I don't know if you remember my opening slide was something like the changes we've wrought on the earth have no precedent in 66 million years. So the difference I would respectfully propose is that we're now in an ecological end game. 1,000 years ago we weren't. The earth was teeming with life, and life for humans was difficult and often short, and life for tigers was a lot better 1,000 years ago. We're now in the, as I called it, the ecological end game. We've, basically stacked all the dice against not just our survival, but the survival of very much at all above the level of microbe over the next 1,000 years or 100 years. And that's the big difference. 100 years ago, I had to worry if I had a parent with a kid in Ireland, the life expectancy, you're absolutely right, might have been 35 or 40 like in India. It was as bad as that. The British were, they were good that way. Us colonials, life was tough, right? And you're absolutely right. And 500 years ago, life was tough. This is different though. We're going from life is tough to life on Earth may well end by the middle of the century. And I mean all of it, or if not all of it, down to a reset that we haven't seen in 66 million years. And that, by the way, is the most likely scenario by mid-century, is that there won't be any humans at all, and there'll be very little of anything else. And after the Yucatan Peninsula asteroid strike, the only land-based critters that survived were 4 or 5 inches long. They were the antecedents of the mammals. All the large things died. Everything large died. And that's what we're heading for, one of those.
We'll call it the Microsoft extinction. Kind of, there's a problem, so you turn it off and turn it back on again.
It's a reboot, if you like. Yeah. It's an involuntary reboot. The scientists call it the sixth extinction. We've had 5 in Earth history. The biggest one was 252 million years ago, when 98% of everything on Earth died. 98% of species.
But the 6th one is our fault.
Oh no, this is a totally unusual one. This is a completely man-made extinction event. And we're right smack in the middle of it. And many species some have already disappeared, many are going to disappear, and apex predators right across the system are disappearing. Right, from sharks to tigers, right across. And strangely enough, we're an apex predator. Normally apex predators, you have a tiny number of them in a biological pyramid. We have an inverse biological pyramid where the top of our pyramid is full of all the apex predators, us. But the bottom pyramid like this, we're hacking away at. And the most vulnerable species in the world today is humans, because the basis of our success hangs by a thread.
I just what is the consensus on the 6th extinction or climate changes as devastating as you suggest? I'm not sure of it's total consensus. I mean, there is different views on how bad it'll be.
You're right.
I mean,
if we were to fill this room up with 100 scientists, 100 climatologists, right? 2 or 3% of them, 2 or 3 of those individuals would say, not so sure about this whole man-made climate thing. The other 97% would tell you it's absolutely real, it's very serious and dangerous. Then we'd move on to talk about the IPCC reports are where the global consensus on this is filtered. Now, the IPCC report set out a bunch of scenarios. They're called RPC 2.5 and 4, all the way up to 8.5. And they give us different scenarios, right? We've tracked RPC 8.5 for the last 25 years. Tracked it perfectly. Now, RPC 8.5 delivers 6 degrees of surface warming this century. And RPC 8.5 will kill almost everything on the face of the Earth this century. Now, that is uncontroversial.
So you'd see it as a
mass extinction,
existential crisis.
I'll give you a tiny example just to explain how this stuff works, right? We have hundreds of billions of tons of methane trapped in permafrost for millennia. Right across the steppes of the frozen Arctic region, right across Siberia, we have permafrost. It goes down maybe 6-10 feet deep. And this basically is frozen methane. It's been frozen for at least 1 million years. Permafrost. The permafrost is melting. Now, if you add in a pulse of methane, now methane, molecule for molecule, methane is 80 times more powerful than carbon dioxide. But it's a trace element. We count it in parts per billion rather than parts per million. But you release a methane pulse from the Arctic region and from Siberia, and you inject that into the climate. And the thing with the methane pulse is it's self-reinforcing. And we do know right now that the fastest heating on Earth is happening in the Arctic regions. So you melt the permafrost, you release the methane. We also have a thing called methane clathrates, which exist as a form of crystalline methane on the shore of continental shelves, on the foot of continental shelves. They're held together by two things. One, extreme pressure, and two, extreme cold. If either extreme pressure or extreme cold changes, those clathrates, which are a crystalline form of methane, absolutely gigantic quantities of them, they go back over eons. If we release them, essentially, what they look like is a huge big bubble up of methane releases from the foot of the sea, hits the atmosphere, and explodes with the power of hundreds of nuclear weapons, spreading fireballs around the... I mean, you see, sorry, welcome to my world, right? This is what I study, unfortunately. We're a hair trigger away from tripping over one or other. Any of these events are species-ending events. And we're walking through a minefield. If you put your foot on methane, you're gone. If you put your foot on causing West Antarctica to collapse into the sea, basically Dublin is gone. Pretty much all the urban capitals of the world are built. Maybe Madrid, not so much. Sea level rise. I mean, we have enough frozen ice on Earth at the moment to add 70 metres sea level rise. 70 metres is, you know, Liberty Hall across the way? That's 70 metres.
Yep.
That's how much extra water is currently waiting to be released from land-based ice to rise global sea levels by whatever that is, 220
By a wetsuit.
feet. By when?
So buy a wetsuit.
Buy a wetsuit, exactly, yeah. Now, these are the genies that are coming out of the bottle. And the thing is, we don't know for sure how long that process is going to take. All we know is, once you pass certain tipping points, right? It's like you're racing in a car towards a cliff. There's a certain point at which you've got to hit the brakes. And if you don't hit the brakes by that point, then certain things become inevitable because you had your point. The problem is we don't know exactly where that point is. And instead of slowing down as we approach the cliff, we've hit the accelerator. We're actually accelerating towards the cliff. And that's a really weird thing, you know, with the likelihood. And believe you me, I have no desire for anything I say here to be true.
Yeah.
You know.
How would you?
Do you still get invited to parties?
Not so much. No, it's one of those things that it's a tough call because that's reality, you know, and reality bites.
If you want to see a film that touches on all what's just been said, there's a free film on YouTube called The Home Project. Home, capital letters. And 90 minutes, free films.
What's the subject of The Home? Is it vegan?
No. It's got a vegan subtext, but it's nothing to do with vegans. It's about carbon. It's about they talk about everything is drops of sunlight and stuff, and it talks about, you know, it looks at Dubai as an ecological disaster and this kind of stuff.
Oh yeah. But it'll be fine. That's the takeaway message: is it'll be fine. You know, enjoy your lives. It'll be fine. But just try not to look surprised.
Try to kill yourself right now.
Yeah. To which to kill yourself right now?
Yeah. Try not to.
Yeah.
Try and enjoy the
Exactly,
last 2 years of life.
Go back and talk to your family.
Yeah. Hug somebody. Yeah.